So I'm going to read to you from Great House, actually quite far into the novel, but if you haven't read it, which I expect most of you haven't, I'm not going to give anything away. All you have to really know about this man who's going to speak to you is that his wife has died, and he has 2 grown sons, and the younger of these sons is estranged. He hasn't seen him or really spoken to him for 25 years. And in the wake of his wife's death, this son has come back to his house in Jerusalem, where he raised the son. And these 2, father and son, are sort of rattling around in this house together for the first time in all these years. And this is the father speaking in sort of in his mind to this grown child. Here, let me begin. You see, my child, a little bit every day I find myself contemplating my death, investigating it, dipping my toe, as it were, not practicing so much as interrogating its conditions while I still possess powers of interrogation and can still fathom oblivion. In one of these little excursions into the unknown, I uncovered something about you that I'd almost forgotten. For the first 3 years of your life, you knew nothing of death. You thought that it would all go on without end. On the first night, you left your crib behind to sleep in a bed. Are you going to fix that horrible noise? Thank you. On the first night, you left your crib behind to sleep in a bed. I came to say goodnight to you. Now I'm going to sleep in a big boy bed forever, you asked? Yes, I said, and we sat together. I imagine you in a flight through the halls of eternity, clutching your blankie, and you imagining whatever a child imagines when he tries to conceive of forever. A few days later, you were sitting at the table playing with the food that you refused to eat. So don't eat, I said, but if you don't eat, you can't leave the table. It's as simple as that. Your lip began to tremble. Go ahead and sleep there for all I care, I said. This isn't how Mama does it, you whined. I don't care how she does it, I spat. This is how I do it, and you're not moving until you eat. You burst into tears, protesting and carrying on. I ignored you. After a while, silence filled the room, punctuated only by your little whimpers. Then, out of nowhere, you announced, when Yoella dies, we'll get a dog. I was surprised, because of the bluntness of the statement, and because I had no idea you knew anything of death. Won't you be sad when she dies, I asked, forgetting for a moment the war of the food. And you very practically replied, yes, because then we won't have a cat to pet. A moment passed. What does it look like when people die, you asked. As if they're asleep, I said, only they don't breathe. You thought about this. Do children die, you asked? I felt a pain open in my chest. Sometimes, I said. Perhaps I should have chosen other words, never or simply no. But I didn't lie to you. At least you can say that of me. Then, turning your little face to me without flinching, you asked, will I die? And as you said the words, horror filled me as it had never before. Tears burned my eyes, and instead of saying what I should have said, not for a long, long time, or, not you, my child, you alone will live forever, I said simply, yes. And because no matter how you suffered, deep inside you were still an animal like any other who wants to live, feel the sun, and be free, you said, but I don't want to die. The terrible injustice of it filled you, and you looked at me as if I were responsible. You'd be surprised by how often in my little peripatetic wanderings through the valley of death, I meet the child you once were. At first it surprised me too, but soon I came to look forward to these encounters. I tried to think about why it was that you would appear like that when the subject had so little to do with you. I came to realize that it had to do with certain feelings I felt for the first time when you were a child. I don't know why Ori didn't arouse the same feelings before you. Maybe I was caught up in other things when he was an infant, or maybe I was still too young. There were only 3 years between you, but in those years I grew up. My youth officially came to an end, and I entered a new stage of life, as a father and a man. By the time you were born, I understood in a way that I could not have with Ori just what the birth of a child means, how he grows, and how his innocence is slowly ruined, how his features change forever the first time he feels shame, how he comes to learn the meaning of disappointment, of disgust, how a whole world is contained inside of him, and it was mine to lose. I felt powerless against these things. And of course, you were a different kind of child than Uri. From the beginning, you seemed to know things and to hold them against me, as if you somehow understood that built into raising a child are inevitable acts of violence against him. Looking down into the crib at your tiny face, contorted by screams of grief, there's nothing else to call it. I've never heard any baby cry like you. I was guilty before I'd even begun. I know how this sounds. After all, you were only a baby. But something about you attacked the weakest part of me, and I backed away. You, as you were then, with your fair hair before it turned coarse and dark. I've heard others say that when their children were born, they tasted their own mortality for the first time. It wasn't that way for me. That isn't the reason I find you hiding there in the shallows of my death. I was too caught up in myself, in the battles of my life, to notice the little winged messenger come to take the torch from my hand and silently pass it on to Uri and you. To notice that from that moment on, I would no longer be the center of all things, the crucible where life, to keep itself alive, burns most vividly. The fire began to cool in me, but I didn't notice. I carried on living as if it was life that needed me and not vice versa. And yet you taught me something of death. Almost without my being aware of it, you smuggled the knowledge into me. Not long after you asked me whether you would die, I heard you talking aloud in the other room. When we die, you said, we'll be hungry. A simple statement, and then you went on humming off tune and pushing your little cars across the floor. But it stayed with me. It seemed to me that no one had ever summed up death quite like that, an unending state of longing with no hope of receiving. I was almost scared by the equanimity with which you faced something so abysmal, how you looked at it and turned it over in your mind as best you could, and found a form of clarity that allowed you to accept it. Maybe I'm ascribing too much meaning to the words of a 3-year-old, but however accidental, there was beauty in them. In life, we sit at the table and refuse to eat, and in death, we're eternally hungry. How can I explain it? The way you frightened me a little. How you seemed just the tiniest bit closer than the rest of us to the essence of things. I would walk into a room and find you staring at something in the corner. What's so fascinating, I wanted to know. But your concentration would be broken, and you would turn to me, a wrinkle in your brow, a faint look of surprise at being disturbed. After you left the room, I would go to see for myself. A spider web, an ant, a disgusting hairball coughed up by Yoella. There was never anything there. What's wrong with him? I asked your mother. He has no friends? By that time, Uri had already befriended the whole neighborhood. There was an endless stream of kids coming in and out of the house for him. The only time Uri spent in the corner was when he was wrapping his arms around himself and wriggling as if he were French kissing. He would run his hands up and down his back, squeeze his own ass, and give a little yelp. But amid the laughter, you were nowhere to be found. Later, pruning the tomato plants, I came across a patch of the garden where you'd mysteriously assembled little piles of dirt into rows, alternated with squares or circles etched into the ground with a stick. What the hell is this? I asked your mother. She cocked her head to study it. It's a city, she announced, without a shade of doubt in her voice. Here's the gate, she pointed, and the fortifications, and this here is a cistern. Then she walked away, leaving me defeated again. Where I saw little pathetic piles of dirt, she saw a whole city. From the beginning, you had given her the keys to yourself, but not to me. Never to me, my son. I spotted you crouching near the hose. Come here, I shouted. You lumbered toward me on your short legs, your face crazily stained from a popsicle. What is the meaning of this? I demanded, gesturing with the clippers. You looked down and sniffed. Then you squatted and carried out some lightning renovations, hurriedly sweeping, patting, refashioning a lump. You stood to examine it again from above, cocking your head at the same angle your mother had. So that was the secret, I thought. You have to turn your head at a special angle to make sense of it. No sooner had I absorbed this clue than you lifted your foot and with a few quick stomps, leveled the entire thing and retreated into the house. Which came first? Was it I who backed away or you? A strange child with secret knowledge that I came to resent, who grew to be a young man whose world was barred to me. Do you want to know the truth, Dove? When you came to tell me about the book you planned to write, I was taken aback. I couldn't understand what made you decide to come to me of all people, me with whom you shared so little of yourself, whom you only spoke to as a last resort when it was absolutely necessary. I was too slow to respond as I might have liked. I couldn't change so fast. I assumed the old position, a certain tone of voice, a roughness that had always been my defense against all I couldn't grasp in you. To reject you before you could reject me. Afterwards, I regretted it. The moment after you walked out of the room, I realized that I'd lost my chance. I understood that you had offered me a reprieve, and I'd squandered it. And I knew it would not come again. Thank you.